5-month-old disabled girl fell asleep. What this kitten did was shocking. The fluorescent lights of the convenience store flickered overhead as Claire counted the loose change in her palm for the third time. $1.87, not even enough for a Kitten formula. Her throat tightened as she glanced down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her worn stroller, unaware of how their world was crumbling around them. "Will that be all, miss?" the cashier asked, his impatience barely masked by forced politeness. Claire's cheeks burned as she returned the small jar of baby food to the shelf. "I'm sorry, I'll come back later." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. There wouldn't be a later, not anymore. Outside, the November wind cut through her thin jacket like knives. The city streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional passing car and the distant wail of sirens, a sound that had become as familiar to Claire as her daughter's cries. At 20, she felt ancient, worn down by months of struggle and sleepless nights. Emma stirred in the stroller, her tiny legs twitching beneath the blanket. The sight sent a fresh wave of pain through Claire's heart. The doctors had been clear about Emma's condition. Without proper physical therapy and medical care, her daughter's chances of ever walking normally were slim. But how could Claire provide that when she could barely keep them fed? She pushed the stroller through the empty streets, her mind replaying the events that had led to this moment. The father who'd disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant. Her parents, who'd given her an ultimatum: give up the baby or give up their support. She'd chosen Emma, believing love would be enough. Now, love felt like the cruelest joke of all. The park loomed ahead, its trees casting long shadows in the dim streetlights. Claire had walked past it countless times during her late-night wanderings, when Emma's colicky cries drove them both from their tiny room in the women's shelter. Tonight, though, the park held a different purpose, one that made her stomach churn with every step. She'd seen the news story last week: a baby left at the steps of St. Mary's Church, now adopted by a wealthy family who could provide everything the child needed. The report had planted a seed in Claire's mind, one that had grown into tonight's desperate plan. As she entered the park, memories flooded her consciousness. Emma's first smile, the way her tiny fingers would wrap around Claire's thumb, the soft coos that made every sleepless night worth it. But mixed with these precious moments were the darker ones: the mounting medical bills, the endless rejections from job applications, the pitying looks from social workers who suggested that other arrangements might be best for everyone. Claire found herself drawn to a bench near the center of the park, partially hidden by overgrown bushes but still visible enough that someone would notice. Someone better equipped to give Emma the life she deserved. Her hands trembled as she lifted Emma from the stroller, cradling her close one last time. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," she whispered, her tears falling onto Emma's soft cheeks. "I thought I could be enough for you. I thought if I just tried hard enough, loved you enough." Her voice broke. "But sometimes love isn't enough, is it? Sometimes love means letting go." Emma's eyes fluttered open, revealing those beautiful brown irises that mirrored Claire's own. For a moment, mother and daughter gazed at each other in the darkness, and Claire almost faltered. But then Emma's legs twitched again, a reminder of all the care she couldn't provide, all the opportunities her daughter would miss because of her inadequacies. With painstaking gentleness, Claire laid Emma on the bench, making sure the blanket was tucked securely around her tiny body. She'd chosen her warmest one, pale pink with little yellow ducks, a gift from a kind nurse at the hospital. Pinned to the blanket was a note she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. "Her name is Emma. She's 5 months old and needs medical care I can't give her. Please love her like I do." Claire's vision blurred as she backed away from the bench. Emma made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question. The sound pierced Claire's heart like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at her to run back, to scoop up her baby and never let go. Instead, she forced herself to turn away. "Goodbye, my sweet girl," she breathed, the words barely audible even to herself. "I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday you'll forgive me." Her feet felt like lead as she walked away, each step an exercise in agony. She didn't allow herself to look back, couldn't look back, knowing that if she did, her resolve would shatter. The stroller squeaked slightly as she pushed it, now emptier than it had ever been. As Claire disappeared into the shadows of the park, she didn't notice the small movement in the bushes near the bench. She didn't see the curious eyes that watched her departure, or the tiny figure that would soon change everything. In that moment, she was aware of nothing but the hollow space in her arms where her world used to be, and the desperate prayer that she'd made the right choice. The night swallowed her whole as she walked, her tears falling freely now. Behind her, in the growing distance, Emma lay alone on the bench, unaware that her life was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would bring together the most unlikely of guardians in a tale of survival, sacrifice, and unconditional love. The park held its breath in the aftermath of Claire's departure. Emma's soft whimpers floated through the night air like lost butterflies, her tiny hands reaching out for comfort that was no longer there. The temperature had dropped further, and the thin blanket, despite Claire's careful tucking, wasn't enough to keep the autumn chill at bay. In the shadows of the overgrown bushes near the bench, a small figure stirred. Mittens, a scrawny kitten no more than 4 months old, had been watching the entire scene unfold through cautious eyes. Life had taught the young cat harsh lessons about humans. Some brought food and gentle words, others brought kicks and cruel laughter. But this was different. Something about the baby's cries stirred a memory deep within Mitten's own heart, an echo of being left alone in a cardboard box behind a restaurant weeks ago. The kitten's own story was one of survival against impossible odds. Its distinctive white paws, which had earned it the name Mittens from the kind restaurant worker who occasionally left out scraps, were now dirty and matted. A fresh scar across its left ear told the tale of a recent encounter with a larger alley cat, and its ribs showed clearly through patchy gray fur. Yet despite its own struggles, Mittens had maintained a gentle spirit, a rarity among the hardened strays of the city. Emma's cries grew more insistent, cutting through the night like tiny arrows of distress. Mitten's ears twitched forward, whiskers quivering with indecision. The bench was exposed, dangerous. Every instinct honed by street life screamed to stay hidden, to mind its own business. But something stronger than instinct was at work tonight. With delicate steps, Mittens emerged from the bushes. The kitten's paws made no sound on the damp grass as it approached the bench, moving with the careful precision that had kept it alive this long. Up close, Emma's face was scrunched in discomfort, her cheeks reddened from crying and cold. Her legs moved restlessly beneath the blanket, kicking with uneven movements that seemed different from the confident kicks Mittens had observed in other human babies. A distant dog's bark made Mittens freeze, for standing on end. The kitten knew all too well the dangers that lurked in the park after dark. During the day, it was filled with playing children and watchful parents, but night transformed it into a hunting ground for strays and wild animals. The thought sent a protective surge through Mitten's small body. Without further hesitation, the kitten leaped onto the bench. Emma's cries hitched at the sudden movement, her brown eyes opening wide to stare at the unexpected visitor. For a moment, kitten and baby regarded each other with matching expressions of curiosity. Then Mittens took another step forward, drawn by an instinct older than fear. The first touch was tentative. Mittens gently pressed a white paw against Emma's blanket, testing. When the baby made no sudden moves, the kitten grew bolder. With careful movements, Mittens circled 3 times before settling against Emma's side, pressing close to share what warmth its small body could offer. Emma's reaction was immediate. Her cries softened to hiccuping whimpers, then to gentle coos as she felt the warmth and comfort of another living being. Her tiny hand reached out, catching a handful of Mittens' fur. Instead of pulling away, the kitten allowed the touch, understanding somehow that this tiny human needed protection just as much as it did. As the night deepened, an unusual bond began to form on that park bench. Mittens, who had never stayed in one place for long, remained steadfastly by Emma's side. When a cold breeze rustled through the trees, the kitten shifted closer, using its body as a shield against the wind. When Emma grew restless, Mittens would gently bump its head against her cheek, purring softly until she settled. Time passed in the strange way it does during the darkest hours of night. The park's usual nighttime sounds, rustling leaves, distant traffic, the occasional siren, created a backdrop to this unlikely vigil. Mitten's ears remained alert, constantly scanning for threats, while Emma drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Around 3 in the morning, the temperature plummeted further. Emma began to shiver despite Mitten's presence, her lips taking on a worrying bluish tinge. The kitten's purring increased in intensity, as if trying to generate more warmth through sheer will. When this wasn't enough, Mittens made a decision that went against every survival instinct. The kitten carefully stood, stretched, and jumped down from the bench. It disappeared into the bushes, returning moments later dragging a discarded newspaper in its mouth. With determined movements, Mittens managed to pull the paper onto the bench, arranging it as an additional layer over Emma's legs. It wasn't much, but combined with the kitten's body heat, it helped block some of the bitter wind. This small act of resourcefulness revealed something extraordinary about Mittens. Despite its youth and the harshness of its own life, the kitten possessed an intelligence and empathy that transcended its circumstances. Perhaps it was because Mittens understood abandonment all too well, or perhaps there was simply something special about this particular stray. Whatever the reason, the kitten had appointed itself Emma's guardian, and it would not abandon its post. As dawn approached, exhaustion began to take its toll on the small guardian. Mitten's eyes grew heavy, but it fought against sleep, knowing instinctively that the approaching daylight would bring new dangers and decisions. The kitten's own hunger gnawed sharply, and its wounds from previous fights ached in the cold. Yet it remained, a tiny sentinel against the darkness, protecting a human child who had no one else in the world to watch over her. Neither Emma nor Mittens could know that their story was far from over, that the night's events had set in motion a chain of circumstances that would change not only their lives but those of others as well. For now, they were simply two abandoned souls finding comfort in each other's presence, waiting for whatever the coming day would bring. The wheels of Jim's shopping cart squeaked through the pre-dawn silence, a sound he'd long since learned to tune out. At 63, he'd been pushing this same cart through these same streets for so long that the metallic protest had become something of a companion, like a cranky old friend who complained but never left your side. Tonight's haul had been decent: 3 aluminum cans, a stack of newspapers that might make decent insulation, and his prize find, a mostly intact wool blanket someone had thrown away because of a small tear. People's wastefulness had long ceased to surprise him, though it still saddened him. In his former life, before the recession had claimed his job, his savings, and finally his home, he'd been guilty of the same thoughtless disposal of perfectly good items. The park wasn't usually part of his normal route. The police tended to be stricter about loitering here, and the regular patrol car that circled every few hours made it risky for someone like him to linger. But tonight something had drawn him to take this detour. Maybe it was the unusual stillness in the air, or maybe it was simply that his arthritic knee was acting up, making him seek a shorter path back to his hidden shelter. The first thing he noticed was movement on one of the benches, just a slight shift of shadow that his street-trained eyes caught automatically. Probably another homeless person seeking rest, he thought. Best to give them space. Territory disputes could turn ugly fast on the streets. But as he drew closer, squinting through the darkness, something seemed off about the shape on the bench. It was too small for an adult, and there was something else, a pair of eyes reflecting the distant streetlight. Cat's eyes. Well now, Jim muttered to himself, his curiosity piqued. He'd always had a soft spot for strays, often sharing what little food he could scrounge with the neighborhood cats. But this one seemed different, more alert, almost protective. He wheeled his cart closer, moving slowly to avoid startling the animal. That's when he heard it, a sound that stopped him dead in his tracks. A baby's soft cooing. "Dear God in heaven," he breathed, his weathered hands gripping the cart handle tighter. The bundle he'd dismissed as discarded clothing suddenly took on a horrifyingly clear shape. A baby, wrapped in a blanket, with a small kitten curled protectively against it. Jim's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He'd survived on the streets this long by following one simple rule: don't get involved. Involvement meant complications, and complications could be deadly for someone in his position. But this was different. This was a baby. Memories he'd long suppressed bubbled to the surface. His own daughter, now grown and stranger to him, who'd stopped trying to contact him years ago. The grandchildren he'd never met. The family photos he used to carry until they'd been stolen along with his backpack at a shelter 3 winters ago. The kitten watched him intently as he approached, its small body tensed but not retreating. If anything, it seemed to press closer to the baby, as if understanding its role as protector. The sight touched something deep in Jim's heart, reminding him of his own humanity, something the streets had tried hard to strip away. "Easy there, little guardian," he murmured, keeping his voice soft and low. "Just want to make sure everything's all right here." When he was close enough to see clearly, his breath caught in his throat. The baby's skin had a slight bluish tint in the dim light, and though the kitten's presence had provided some warmth, it clearly wasn't enough. A discarded newspaper had been dragged over the child's legs, the kitten's work, he realized with amazement. Jim's gnarled fingers found the note pinned to the blanket, and he squinted to read it in the poor light. Each word felt like a punch to his gut. He knew desperation when he saw it. Hadn't he lived it himself these past years? But leaving a baby. "What do you think, little one?" he asked the kitten, who regarded him with steady eyes. "Quite a responsibility you've taken on here." The smart thing would be to call the police. They'd handle it, get the baby somewhere safe. But Jim had learned the hard way that involving authorities didn't always lead to the best outcomes. He'd seen too many children shuffle through the system, too many families torn apart by well-meaning but rigid bureaucracy. Besides, his relationship with the local police was complicated. Would they even believe him if he reported finding a baby? More likely they'd assume he had something to do with it, maybe even accuse him of trafficking or kidnapping. No, the police weren't an option, at least not yet. The baby, Emma, according to the note, stirred in her sleep, one small hand reaching out to grab the kitten's fur. The animal allowed it with remarkable patience, even starting to purr. The sound seemed to soothe the child, and Jim found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "I'll check back," he promised himself aloud, trying to justify his decision to walk away. "Give it an hour. Maybe the mother will return. Sometimes people just need a moment to clear their heads, right?" But even as he spoke the words, he knew he was fooling himself. The note was too final, the abandonment too carefully planned. Still, he needed that hour, needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do in a situation like this. With heavy steps, he backed away from the bench. The kitten watched him go, its eyes seeming to hold both understanding and judgment. Jim felt that gaze like a physical weight on his shoulders as he pushed his cart back into the shadows. 1 hour, he repeated firmly. Just 1 hour to think things through. As he disappeared into the darkness, the weight of his decision pressed against his chest like a physical thing. He'd spent years learning to mind his own business, to turn a blind eye to the countless tragedies that played out on these streets every day. But something about this situation, the helpless baby, the brave little kitten, the raw desperation in that simple note, told him that his life was about to change dramatically. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was just how right he was, and how that 1 hour of indecision would nearly cost 2 innocent lives. The moon had slipped behind thick clouds, casting the park in deeper shadows than before. In the 40 minutes since Jim's departure, the temperature had dropped further, and an unsettling silence had fallen over the area, the kind of silence that often preceded danger in the urban wilderness. Mitten sensed it first. The kitten's ears pricked forward, its body tensing against Emma's sleeping form. Something was wrong. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, had all ceased, replaced by a heavy stillness that made the fur along its spine rise. Then came the smell, musky, predatory, familiar from too many close calls in alleyways. Dogs. Not the well-fed pets that visited the park during daylight hours, but the wild pack that roamed these streets after dark. Mittens had encountered them before, barely escaping with its life. The scar on its ear was a reminder of their last meeting. They emerged from the darkness like shadows coming alive, 5 dogs of varying sizes, all lean with hunger and hardened by life on the streets. Their leader, a massive mixed breed with a torn ear and a scar across his muzzle, stepped forward first. His yellow eyes fixed on the bench, nostrils flaring as he caught Emma's scent. Mittens knew what they saw: prey, vulnerable and alone. The kitten's natural instincts screamed to flee, to save itself while it still could. But that would mean leaving Emma defenseless, and something deeper than instinct made that impossible. Instead, Mittens rose to its feet, positioning itself between the approaching pack and the sleeping baby. The lead dog's lip curled, revealing yellowed fangs. He'd killed cats before, the entire pack had, and one tiny kitten seemed hardly worth noticing. But as he took another step forward, Mittens did something unexpected. Instead of cowering or running, the kitten drew itself up to its full height, pitiful as it was, and let out a warning hiss that seemed far too fierce for its small size. Emma stirred at the sound, her eyes fluttering open. The movement caught the dog's attention, their heads snapping toward her with predatory focus. The baby, sensing the tension in the air, began to whimper. The sound triggered something in the pack, their muscles tensing for attack. The first dog, a scraggly brown mutt, lunged forward, teeth bared. Mittens reacted with lightning speed, swiping at its nose with extended claws. The dog yelped in surprise, more startled than hurt, but it was enough to make it stumble back. This only seemed to anger the others, who began to advance as a group. Mittens' heart raced, but its determination never wavered. The kitten became a blur of motion, leaping and scratching, using its small size and agility to its advantage. When one dog got too close to Emma's feet, Mittens landed on its face, clawing furiously until it retreated with a howl of pain. But it was an uneven fight, and Mittens was already tired from its night-long vigil. A snap of jaws came too close, grazing its tail. Another dog circled around the bench, trying to get at Emma from the other side. Mittens couldn't be everywhere at once, but it tried, launching itself back and forth, refusing to give up any ground. Emma's cries grew louder, echoing through the park. The sound seemed to drive the dogs into a frenzy, their attacks becoming more aggressive. The lead dog, who had been watching until now, finally made his move. He leaped onto the bench with a snarl that seemed to shake the very air. In that moment, Mittens made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. The kitten launched itself directly at the lead dog's face, claws extended, aiming for his eyes. It was a stupid move, but Mittens didn't hesitate. Its claws connected, drawing blood, and the massive dog reared back with a roar of pain and fury. The victory was short-lived. With one violent shake of his head, the lead dog sent Mittens flying. The kitten slammed into the pavement with a sound that seemed far too loud for such a small body. Pain exploded through its side, and for a moment the world spun in a dizzying blur. But even as it lay there, struggling to stand on shaking legs, Mittens' focus remained on Emma. The baby was screaming now, her cries piercing the night air. The dogs were closing in again, their confidence growing as they saw their tiny opponent wounded and weakened. Through blurred vision, Mittens saw the lead dog preparing for another attack, this time aimed directly at Emma. The kitten's body screamed in protest as it forced itself to move, to crawl back toward the bench. It wouldn't make it in time, couldn't make it in time, but still it tried, dragging itself forward with desperate determination. Then, just as all seemed lost, a sound split the night, the sharp crack of glass shattering against concrete. A bottle exploded near the pack, sending shards flying. The dogs jumped back, startled by this new threat. "Get away from them, you mangy beasts!" Jim's voice boomed across the park, filled with a fury that seemed to shake the very ground. He emerged from the shadows like an avenging angel, his cart abandoned behind him as he charged forward, another bottle already in his hand. The pack hesitated, caught off guard by this new development. When Jim hurled the second bottle, accompanied by a roar that carried all the rage of his years on the street, their nerve broke. Even the lead dog, still bleeding from Mittens' attack, seemed to decide this fight wasn't worth it. With snarls of frustration and fear, they turned and fled into the darkness, their nails clicking against the pavement as they retreated. Jim rushed to the bench, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Emma was unharmed, though terrified, her face red from crying. But Mittens, the kitten, lay on the ground, its gray fur matted with dirt and blood, sides heaving with labored breaths. With gentle hands that belied his rough appearance, Jim scooped up the injured kitten. Mittens didn't resist, didn't even flinch, whether from trust or exhaustion was impossible to tell. The tiny body trembled in his palms, but those bright eyes remained fixed on Emma, still watching, still protecting. "You brave little soul," Jim whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You wonderful, brave little soul." The night's silence returned, but it was different now, charged with the aftermath of battle and the weight of decisions that could no longer be postponed. Jim looked from the injured kitten in his hands to the baby on the bench, knowing that his life had just changed irrevocably. He couldn't walk away now, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen or been moved by what he'd witnessed. The hour he'd promised himself had nearly cost everything. Now, standing in the aftermath of Mitten's incredible defense, Jim knew exactly what he had to do, even if he had no idea how he was going to do it. Jim's hands trembled as he gathered Emma into his arms, careful not to jostle her too much. The baby had finally stopped crying, though her tiny body still shuddered with occasional hiccups. Mittens, despite its injuries, refused to be left behind. The kitten struggled to its feet, swaying slightly but determined to stay close to Emma. "You're something else, aren't you?" Jim murmured to the kitten, his voice rough with emotion. "Never seen anything like what you did tonight. Never thought I would." The reality of his situation began to sink in as he stood there, holding a baby he had no right to hold, watching a wounded kitten that had shown more courage than most humans he'd known. His shelter was no place for an infant, he knew that. The abandoned subway station he called home was damp, dark, and barely suitable for him, let alone a baby and an injured cat. But he couldn't very well stand here all night, and the authorities, well, that was complicated. In his experience, calling the police would lead to questions he couldn't answer, assumptions about his involvement that could land him in serious trouble. No, he needed time to think, to plan. Just a few hours to figure out the right thing to do. "Come on, little warrior," he said to Mittens, who was trying to follow him but clearly struggling. With a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as the gruff old homeless man who roamed the streets, Jim managed to cradle both Emma and Mittens against his chest. His shopping cart would have to wait, he could retrieve it later. The journey to his shelter was slow and careful. Every shadow made him tense, expecting the dog pack to return, though logically he knew they'd likely moved on to easier hunting grounds. Emma, seemingly comforted by both his warmth and Mittens' presence, had drifted into an uneasy sleep. The kitten remained alert despite its injuries, those bright eyes scanning their surroundings as if still on guard duty. The entrance to Jim's shelter was hidden behind a rusted maintenance door that most people assumed was locked. He'd discovered it 2 winters ago during a particularly brutal cold snap, and it had saved his life that season. The old subway station had been abandoned during budget cuts years ago, sealed off from the active parts of the system by concrete barriers and time. As they descended the stairs, Jim spoke softly, as much to calm himself as his small companions. "It's not much, but it's dry and safe. Nobody comes down here except me and the rats, and they know to keep their distance." His living space was tucked into what had once been a station manager's office. Over the years, he'd managed to accumulate a few essential comforts: a relatively clean mattress salvaged from a college dorm clear-out, some plastic crates that served as furniture, and a collection of blankets in varying states of repair. A battery-powered lamp provided weak but adequate light, and he even had a small camping stove for heating water, though fuel was a precious commodity he used sparingly. Jim laid Emma gently on his mattress, creating a barrier of rolled blankets to prevent her from rolling off. Then he turned his attention to Mittens, who needed immediate care. The kitten's injuries, while not life-threatening, were concerning. Its breathing was labored, and dried blood matted the fur along its side. "Let's get you cleaned up, brave one," Jim said, reaching for his water bottle. He'd been saving the water for drinking, but this seemed more important. Tearing a strip from his cleanest shirt, he began to carefully clean Mittens' wounds. The kitten allowed this treatment with remarkable patience, though it never took its eyes off Emma. As he worked, Jim's mind raced through possibilities. He knew of a church-run shelter a few blocks away, St. Michael's. Unlike some of the other shelters in the area, they'd never turned him away, even when he was at his worst. Sister Margaret, who ran the place, had a reputation for asking few questions and offering help first, paperwork second. But that would have to wait until morning. For now, his priority was keeping his unusual charges warm and safe through what remained of the night. He arranged his remaining blankets into a nest around Emma and Mittens, who had already reclaimed its position as the baby's protector despite its injuries. Looking at them together, the abandoned baby and her tiny, wounded guardian, Jim felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. He'd spent so long just surviving, focusing on getting through each day, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to be responsible for something beyond his own existence. "What a mess we're in," he sighed, settling himself on the floor beside the mattress. "A homeless man, a stray cat, and a baby who needs medical care none of us can provide. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, doesn't it?" Emma stirred in her sleep, one small hand reaching out. Without hesitation, Mittens stretched out its neck, allowing the baby to grab a handful of fur. The simple gesture of trust and comfort brought unexpected tears to Jim's eyes. He thought about his own daughter, Amanda, and the grandchildren he'd never met. How many times had he dreamed of a chance to prove he could be better, do better? Now here he was, presented with an opportunity to help, and all he had to offer was an abandoned subway station and empty pockets. But as he watched Mittens snuggle closer to Emma, purring despite its pain, Jim realized something important. Sometimes help wasn't about what you had to offer materially. Sometimes it was simply about being there, about choosing to step up when stepping away would be easier. "Try to rest," he told Mittens, though the kitten showed no signs of relaxing its vigil. "I'll keep watch now. You've done more than enough for one night." The hours until dawn crept by slowly. Jim divided his time between checking on Emma's temperature, thankfully stable in the relative warmth of the shelter, and tending to Mittens' wounds as best he could. He also found himself talking, sharing stories of his past life with his silent companions. He told them about his years as a construction foreman, about Amanda's first steps, about the series of misfortunes and bad decisions that had led him to the streets. "But maybe," he whispered, as the first hints of morning began to filter through the grates above, "maybe this is why I ended up here. Maybe I needed to be in that park tonight." The thought gave him strength as he began to plan their next move. When the shelter opened at 7, he would take Emma and Mittens to Sister Margaret. She would know what to do, how to get Emma the medical care she needed. And maybe, just maybe, she would understand why a homeless man had spent the night protecting an abandoned baby and her unlikely guardian angel instead of calling the authorities immediately. As if sensing his thoughts, Mittens looked up at him with those wise eyes, and Jim felt something shift in his heart. Whatever happened next, their lives had become intertwined in a way that couldn't be undone. Sometimes family wasn't about blood or circumstances. Sometimes it was about being there when it mattered most. Sister Margaret had seen many strange sights in her 20 years running St. Michael's shelter, but the trio that appeared at her door that morning stopped her in her tracks. A weathered homeless man she recognized as Jim, cradling both a baby and an injured kitten, all three looking like they'd been through war together. "They need help," was all Jim said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Sister Margaret's first call was to her contact at Mercy Hospital, where she'd built a relationship over years of helping the homeless access medical care. Within 30 minutes, an ambulance arrived, its lights mercifully silent in deference to the early hour. Jim insisted on riding with them to the hospital, refusing to leave Emma's side. More surprisingly, when a vet tech from the animal hospital next door to St. Michael's offered to take Mittens for treatment, the kitten raised such a fuss about being separated from Emma that they eventually gave up and let it stay, provided it remained in its carrier during transport. The story broke faster than anyone expected. A young reporter named Sarah Chin, who'd been working on a series about homelessness in the city, happened to be at Mercy Hospital interviewing staff for her story. When she saw Jim in the waiting room, still watching over Emma while hospital staff ran tests, still accompanied by a bandaged but alert Mittens. She knew she had stumbled onto something extraordinary. The headline hit social media first. Homeless man and stray kitten save abandoned baby. Within hours, it was picked up by local news stations. By evening, national networks were running the story. The security camera footage from a nearby building, showing Mitten's desperate fight against the dogs and Jim's timely intervention, went viral overnight. Claire saw the story on her phone during her break at the diner where she'd finally found work, minimum wage, but it was something. The sight of Emma's face on the screen made her knees buckle. She'd spent the past 24 hours alternating between numbing guilt and desperate rationalization, telling herself she'd done the only thing she could. But seeing her baby, hearing about the dangers she'd faced, learning how close she'd come to losing her forever, it shattered all her defenses. She arrived at the hospital in tears, barely able to speak. The police were already there, of course. They'd been trying to identify the baby since her arrival. Claire's confession tumbled out between sobs. The poverty, the desperation, Emma's medical needs, the impossible choice she thought she had to make. To everyone's surprise, it was Jim who spoke up in her defense. "I've been on the streets long enough to know what desperation looks like," he told the officers. "This young lady didn't abandon her baby because she didn't care. She did it because she cared too much to watch her suffer without proper care. Instead of judging her, maybe we should be asking why a mother in our city felt she had no other choice." The story's viral spread had unexpected consequences. A local medical center offered to provide Emma's physical therapy pro bono. A GoFundMe set up by Sarah Chin raised enough money to cover a year's rent for Claire and Emma in a modest apartment. Job offers came in for Claire, real ones, with benefits and childcare assistance. But the most surprising transformation was Jim's. His clear-eyed defense of Claire, combined with his actions that night, caught the attention of Sister Margaret's brother, who ran a construction company. He remembered Jim from the old days before the recession. Within a week, Jim had a job offer as a site supervisor in a small apartment above the company's office. "You're not just hiring me because of the publicity, are you?" Jim asked warily. "I'm hiring you because you showed more character in one night than most people show in a lifetime," was the reply. "The fact that you're qualified and I know your work from before is a bonus." The custody situation was delicate, but with support from social services and Claire's obvious remorse and determination to do better, a plan was worked out. Claire would retain custody of Emma, but with mandatory check-ins and support services. She embraced these requirements, determined to prove she could be the mother Emma deserved. As for Mittens, there was never any question about where the kitten would end up. Despite numerous adoption offers that poured in after the story went viral, Mittens had already chosen its family. The kitten's devotion to Emma hadn't wavered during their hospital stay, and Claire understood that separating them would be unthinkable. "I think," she told Emma as they settled into their new apartment, watching Mittens explore the space with cautious excitement. "Your guardian angel came with fur and whiskers." The story could have ended there, with each character finding their piece of happiness. But life isn't always about neat endings. Sometimes it's about new beginnings that ripple outward in unexpected ways. Jim used his first paycheck to create a small fund at St. Michael's, specifically to help mothers in crisis. He called it the Emma's Angels Fund. And while it wasn't huge, it was enough to provide emergency assistance to women in situations similar to Claire's. Claire, inspired by her experience, started taking night classes in social work while working at her new job. Her goal was to help other young mothers navigate the system she'd felt so lost in. She also became a regular volunteer at local animal shelters, often bringing Emma and Mittens along to help socialize other stray kittens. Sister Margaret used the attention from the story to push for better coordination between social services and homeless outreach programs. The local government, pressed by public interest in the story, finally approved funding for a new family crisis center adjacent to St. Michael's. And Mittens? The tiny kitten who'd shown such extraordinary courage grew into a beautiful cat, still never far from Emma's side. As Emma grew stronger through her physical therapy, Mittens was there, encouraging her in ways only a devoted pet can. When Emma took her first unassisted steps at age 3, it was with her hands buried in Mitten's fur for balance and confidence. On the 1-year anniversary of that fateful night, they all gathered at St. Michael's, Claire and Emma, Jim, Sister Margaret, even Sarah Chin, who'd become something of a family friend. Mitten sat regally on Emma's lap, accepting treats and attention with the dignity of a cat who knew its own worth. "You know," Jim said, watching Emma giggle as Mittens gently batted at her hair, "I used to think being homeless meant being invisible. But that night, I learned something important. Sometimes the ones society overlooks, the strays, the lost, the forgotten, they're the ones capable of the most extraordinary acts of love." Claire reached over and squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "We were all strays that night, weren't we? All lost in our own ways. But we found each other. And that," Sister Margaret added softly, "is what makes a family. Not blood, not circumstance, but the choice to be there for each other, no matter what." Outside the shelter windows, the city continued its endless rhythm, unchanged yet somehow different. Because now there was a story being told on its streets, a story about second chances, about courage wearing unexpected forms, about love that defies explanation and hope that refuses to die. And somewhere in that city, in a cozy apartment where a little girl slept peacefully under the watchful eye of her feline guardian, the promise of that hope lived on. After all, as Jim would often say, sometimes the best families are the ones we build ourselves, one stray heart at a time.